Hi, this week we're going to talk about some of the science behind hyperinsulinemia and the metabolic syndrome and how that relates to fasting. And it's coming right up. Metabolic syndrome is classically defined as 5 related problems: abdominal obesity, insulin resistance, high triglycerides, low HDL, and hypertension or high blood pressure. And these 5 things tend to be found together, they cluster together, and they increase the risk of cardiovascular disease quite a bit, and that's why it's so important. And they cluster because they're really all related to the presence of too much insulin. We've discussed in a previous video how insulin resistance relates to the fact that there seems to be all this blood in the glucose, and insulin's job, one of which is to push it into the cell, doesn't seem to be working. And there's really 2 ways that this can happen. Either the blood glucose can't get in because the sort of gate is closed, or it could be that the cell is just overflowing with glucose already, so therefore the insulin can't really push it in. And we talked about how the overflow hypothesis really works better. Sort of like luggage that's too full. You simply can't put any more in once it's full. Well, how does this develop from a scientific standpoint? If you look at what happens to glucose, once it enters the cell, it undergoes a process called glycolysis, and it changes into pyruvate, which then undergoes the process of pyruvate oxidation to acetyl-CoA, and that's the sort of basic building block of energy. The glucose gets turned into acetyl-CoA, but the amino acids and the fats from proteins and dietary fats can also enter the cycle at this point. Obviously, they're not glucose, but they enter either at pyruvate or they enter at acetyl-CoA. And once it does that, then it undergoes the citric acid cycle, which then generates ATP. And ATP is the currency of energy that is used. If the cell develops too much ATP, it's like an overheating furnace. There's just too much of this stuff around. Well, just like in that furnace, you want to shut it down. So the cell has the same issue. If there's too much ATP, then it's going to feed back and shut down the glycolysis, the pyruvate oxidation, as well as the citric acid cycle, so that it doesn't generate so much ATP, and that's for the safety of the cell. What happens then, of course, is if all of those processes shut down, then the glucose is going to build up inside the cell. And what happens is that the glucose outside the cell can't get into the cell that easily because there's more and more glucose built up. Remember that insulin acts by activating GLUT4, which goes to the cell surface and it opens a gate so that the glucose from the outside can come into the cell. But this depends on a process called facilitated diffusion. That is, there has to be a concentration difference for the glucose outside the cell to migrate its way inside the cell. And if the glucose outside the cell isn't that different from the glucose inside the cell, well, then it's not going to go inside. As the glucose inside the cell builds up, there's no concentration gradient, the glucose can't come in, and therefore it stays outside, and what you see is so-called insulin resistance. And that's, from a cellular standpoint, how this develops. Well, what happens to all this excess glucose that's just sitting inside the cell? This all happens in the liver, and the liver wants to get rid of all this glucose because it doesn't want to sit around with this glucose. So now it activates this process called de novo lipogenesis, which means de novo means from new, lipo means fat, genesis means creation. So you're creating new fat, which is a molecule called triglycerides, and you're getting it from glucose. You're turning glucose into new fat. And that's how it builds up. That's how you get fatty liver, because you have too much of this de novo lipogenesis, which is built upon too much glucose and too much insulin. So as you get this fat building up inside the liver still doesn't want this extra fat. Fat is supposed to be carried in the fat cell and not in the liver. So what does the liver do? Well, it wants to get rid of this fat, and it does it through this process called cholesterol transport. So it takes the new triglycerides, which is the fat, packages it up with some proteins called lipoproteins, and becomes VLDL, which is very low density lipoprotein. And this is a fat molecule which has a lot of triglycerides. And therefore, when you check the blood, the cholesterol panel in your blood, you may find very high triglycerides, one of the key elements of the metabolic syndrome. Well, the triglycerides that are in the blood then go to the cells, and the cells are going to activate LPL, which is lipoprotein lipase, and they're going to take this triglycerides out. So this process of cholesterol transport is moving newly created fat from glucose from the liver into the other organs. And that's how you're going to get the fat deposition around the abdomen, which gives you the abdominal obesity, which is again classic for metabolic syndrome. You're going to get fat deposition in the muscles, fat deposition in the pancreas as well. Once the VLDL has some of that triglycerides drained out, it becomes IDL, or intermediate density lipoprotein, and at the same time, HDL goes down. So therefore, you see the high triglycerides and you see the low HDL, another key component of the metabolic syndrome. The intermediate density lipoprotein then goes back to the liver, which becomes LDL, which is sometimes called the bad cholesterol and is easily measured when we do the cholesterol panel. In this metabolic syndrome, then, you can now trace how this all relates to too much insulin or hyperinsulinemia. That is, you get too much glucose, which is from your diet, which is causing too much insulin to be secreted. And that's going to give you high blood pressure because the insulin is going to try to keep all of that sugar as well as the salt inside, which can raise your blood pressure. It's going to cause the increased de novo lipogenesis, which increases triglycerides, decreases HDL, and that, in a nutshell, is all of the metabolic syndrome. So that's some of the science behind how all of this clusters together. When you look at what the root cause of this metabolic syndrome is, then you can say, okay, well, what caused it in the first place? Because we know it's a huge epidemic in our modern society. And it comes back to the diet because it's too much easily available glucose, although amino acids and proteins can also play a role, as well as dietary fat, because all of them can feed into that cycle with the glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation, and citric acid cycle. So the root cause is too much glucose, too much insulin, which gives you all of those 5 things we talked about: the abdominal obesity, insulin resistance, high triglycerides, low HDL, and high blood pressure. And it's all due to hyperinsulinemia. So if the root cause is too much insulin, well, what's the best solution? And that's where intermittent fasting comes in, because if you don't eat anything, you're going to get no glucose, but you're also going to get no protein and no fat. So therefore, you're going to maximally lower that process, which is causing the buildup of energy inside the cell, which is what set the whole thing off in the first place. I hope you learned something. It's important to keep in mind some of the science behind how it's being developed so that you can go back and translate it to your diet. I'll see you next week.